if you think about the whole customer development lifecycle, if you think about, the very beginning all the way through to, we're the market leader and we're just growing and we have all these users and we're just, making incremental changes and that sort of thing. There's a period in there between those two things that is the sort of the growth, the growth period. You look at big companies that are in hyper growth, like, Uber, right? Uber is in hyper growth. Like, they have product market fit. They have a product that does a thing that lots of people understand. It's not just early adopters in the tech market. It's not just a little tiny, group of people that, they're iterating and testing on. They've hit, like, this is a thing that they have found that a lot of people in the mainstream apparently want, right? That they're using and that they get and they understand it. So now they're in this hyper growth period, right? And they're adding more and more and more and more users. And then hopefully later on, what happens with companies is that they hit the sort of sustaining innovation, right? They're making the product and it's a product that works, and maybe if they're doing big innovations, they're doing it in new products. They're starting to develop new lines of business. Looking at something that's sort of maybe even more established, something like Amazon, right? Or hell, cars, right? Cars in general. When cars started out, they were for they were for people who liked to tinker with engines and who liked little, things that they didn't mind that they broke down all the time and they knew how to fix them and there was no place to take, there were no parts, like you had to kind of build your own, right? It kind of feels like, like what I imagine the 1970s was like for people who are building their own computers, right? That it's the same cycle, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, now there's like some people want this. Okay, great. And then Henry Ford's got this line that just pumps out cars that, for normal people, but it's still not everyone. It's still kind of rich people or, people who have specific needs. They're still kind of the early adopters. But, now it's just like, of course, everybody has a car, right? And like we just put out new models and it's not like anybody's like, what's a car? But then we start to see different innovations in that space, right? We start to see self-driving cars, or we start to see car sharing, or we start to see things that grow up around, or electric cars, right? We start to see things that grow up around that. So when I think about that, finding the product market fit, that happens at that very beginning. And the trick is you cannot start your growth part of your customer life cycle or your product life cycle until you found it, until you have a product that people do want and people do understand, and that has probably been loved by early adopters for quite some time and tinkered with, and and that you figured out a way that like we can now take the core of this and move it to the rest of the world, right? Or at least the rest of the world that we care about, the car driving rest of the world. So that's what I really think about, is that I think a lot of people start that growth period way too soon in their product life cycle, without going through all that, really struggling to find a thing that a group like that solves a common problem for lots of people. It's still not going to be everybody. Everybody doesn't need Uber, right? It's still a specific group of people for quite some time. But not everybody has a car, right? Like yeah. Cars don't solve for everybody. Nothing is for everybody. So I'm really saying, who are the people who have this problem? Not demographically, but what is the problem that we're solving? And how do we reach folks with that problem and make our offering work for them?